This episode of The Big Shut-In is brought to you by Gotham Ed, an educational series by our friends at the Gotham Center for New York City History, a part of CUNY, the City University of New York. Gotham Ed presents a unique slate of online courses about the history of New York City, designed to serve a range of backgrounds and purposes, from those who are generally interested and looking for a compact introduction, to avid history buffs in search of a much deeper dive. The program offers a mixture of private lectures with discussion and more intimate traditional semi-weekly classes, exploring topics large and small, varying in length with multiple days and times to choose from, and conducted on a digital platform year-round. This series can accommodate any schedule. Want to learn more about what made New York, New York? Go to Gotham Ed. That's GOTHAMED.com. My name is David, and this is The Big Shut-In. It's Sunday, January 24th, 2021, day 315 since the shut-in began. And today we're going to get another international perspective. I spoke this evening with Janet, who is a native of Los Angeles, but now lives with her husband and children in Hong Kong. And her experience is really interesting because, you know, for those of us who are used to living in cities, we're used to a certain proximity with other humans. But Hong Kong is a place where that kind of closeness is just magnified tremendously. It has some of the most incredibly dense population of anywhere on the planet. And it's a place where people have very tiny apartments and basically live outside and live in restaurants and live in parks and live cheek by jowl and elbow to elbow with each other. And of course, that's the stuff that is particularly dangerous in COVID. And so for a place like that to figure out how to do this has presented some real challenges. And yet, despite some egregious exceptions that we'll hear about, they seem to be doing it a lot better than we are here in the United States, where we have a lot more elbow room to spare. So, let's hear from Janet. How are you? How are you doing?
I think that's a very complicated question. I have ups and downs. Right now, I'm okay. I think there's a line from the Home Edit. They say surviving, not thriving. That I think pretty much sums up how I'm doing. I think it's really just about survival right now, and I feel like it's been like that for a long time. Right now, we're doing okay. After I had my son, and my maternity leave ended, I decided not to go back to work. And it so happened that when I quit, that's when the protests started. And then now COVID has happened. Things aren't great in Hong Kong. Obviously, this is relative. From a COVID perspective, relative to the US, I think Hong Kong has done a pretty good job of handling the situation. We're having a spike in cases, and for the first time, they've locked down part of Hong Kong. Since COVID started, they haven't had to do that. I think it's Yasim Mong. I believe my Cantonese is terrible, but that area includes a pretty populous area. It's very condensed, and there are a lot of people who live there.
That one area is sort of the first lockdown for COVID?
Actually, it's where I used to work. I used to work for the UN Refugee Agency here in Hong Kong, and they had an office in Yamate. And so I'm very familiar with the area. There are a lot of immigrants that live there. A lot of our asylum seekers and refugees live there. And so that area of town is a bit more poor. And so people live in tenement houses, like subdivided flats. There's hardly any separation between families. And so I think there's been outbreaks in a lot of the buildings. It's not great in Hong Kong, but I do feel slightly removed from the situation because I don't live or work there, and we're expats, and I don't interact with that population anymore. So I feel kind of secluded from it, but at the same time, it's not that far away from where we are. So anyways.
That surprises me, though, that you haven't had to have a lockdown until
Yeah.
now.
Well, I don't know the details of the lockdown, but it's the first time that they've had to lock down any part of Hong Kong since COVID started. So, I mean, it kind of shows you the seriousness of the outbreak there.
It strikes me as a different kind of challenge, right? For a tiny little place, geographically tiny, like Hong
Yeah.
Kong, that can kind of barricade itself and kind of pull up the drawbridges, and, as
Yeah.
opposed to like the United States as a continent, like trying to, I mean, you can't.
I I think what boggles my mind is that, Hong Kong is very densely populated. There's a lot of unique challenges to locking down in Hong Kong. I mean, people live in teeny tiny apartments. I can see how difficult it can be.
Give me a sense of your living situation, sort of where you live and the size of your family. How big is your place? Like, you know,
I live in mid levels, which is in the center of Hong Kong. I'm very fortunate to live here, and I live here with my family, my husband, and my two kids. Hong Kong is a very unique place for a lot of different reasons, but one of the benefits of living in Hong Kong while with young children is that you can have affordable childcare. And I'm also very lucky to have two helpers. And because of that, I think there aren't like daycare in Hong Kong. We have a relatively larger flat, I think, than the average Hong Konger. So I'm very fortunate. So we moved out to Hong Kong for my husband's work, and they sent us out here for a home finding trip. And, this real estate agent showed us around flats, different flats, and it was so small. And I asked her, like, does like regular size furniture fit in these flats? And she said, no, we have Hong Kong size furniture. And then she told me Hong Kong people are small so that they can live in Hong Kong size flats. The apartments are tiny, and there are people who live in places where there are no kitchens. It was actually really sad. They tried to close restaurants, I think during the last wave. They tried to prevent dining in, but there were like a lot of like construction workers and all these people whose their only break is during lunchtime, and it's to go to these restaurants. It's the only hour they get air conditioning, and it's really hot and humid in the summer. So all these poor street workers or construction workers had to sit on the street and eat their lunch, and they had to reverse the measure after a couple of days because people were really suffering. So I think Hong Kong has some unique challenges. But in the US, you have space. I mean, people have cars. Like in LA, I just don't understand like why it's so bad, because you can isolate in your house and you have a car. You don't have to interact with people. But the vast majority of people here live in large apartment buildings with that are cramped, and it's just I don't understand.
there are many things I don't understand about the world right now. The list is long.
This is
Um,
true.
I mean, tell me about sort of give me a better sense of the changes that have happened to in your life lately, and how the routine is different with you and with your kids and with your husband and with work and all these things, with the way things had been last year and the way they are now.
So my family had decided to move about 2 years ago in March, and we're very lucky to have done so because in June of that year, the protests started in Hong Kong. And so we were basically under lockdown then. I mean, they didn't have to lock us down, but no one went anywhere because on the weekends there were protests everywhere, and we actually got stuck in one on like inadvertently. We had gone out to eat with my family, and we were pulling out, and there were protesters all over the streets, and this is like in the middle of Hong Kong, like in
When was
central.
this? What are we talking about?
I want to say it was like June or July. It might have been July of um,
2019?
2019. Yeah,
Okay.
2019.
Yeah.
And that was a really tense time because I just remember my daughter was at school, and I didn't want her taking the bus because I didn't want her to be stuck on the bus for hours, because if they're blocking the streets, the kids could very well be stuck on buses. And there were actually a couple situations where I think the protesters attacked buses, school buses. And actually my daughter's like preschool nursery that she had gone to, one of their buses was attacked by some protesters. So, I was really nervous about putting her on the bus. And it was just a very tense time. And we didn't go out on weekends because we didn't know where the next protest would be, because they were very organized. They had like secret channels by which they communicated to organize these protests. There were a lot of texts going around telling people, oh, avoid these areas. But still, I feel like I've been under lockdown since June of 2019, because right after that, like, I think things started getting better around December 2019. Then in January is when COVID hit Hong Kong. So
Well, so the lockdowns from the political protests lasted for 6 months, you're saying? I
yeah,
mean,
definitely. Yeah, at least 6 months. I think COVID is what stopped the political protests. I mean, that and the national security law.
wow. And I don't want to, if we need to tiptoe here, but
Yeah, we should
um,
tread very carefully.
there's a lot of talk here about, and I know Hong Kong is China, but it's not really China, but it is, and China is a very big place. But the fact that famously originated, this is originally the first outbreak in the world was in China, yeah, and
Yeah.
there's been a lot of politicization of that here, which is gross. But
Yep.
that I'm surprised that your waves are sort of tracking month to month with ours here. That you're not 3 months ahead or 4 months ahead. Do you
Yeah,
know what I
I
mean? That
mean,
surprises me a little.
so let me back up. Things first started in Hong Kong around January of last year. So about a year ago, I think we had maybe heard about the first cases. It was right, and Chinese New Year last year was at the end of January. And I specifically remember we had gone to birthday parties in the middle of January, and then it was Chinese New Year. And during Chinese New Year, they said there's, that at the time it wasn't named, it didn't have a name, but at the time, so COVID had come to Hong Kong through travelers or whomever, and they shut things down, certain things, like, I think, well, businesses and everything schools were already closed because of Chinese New Year, so people stayed home anyways. But then as Chinese New Year was ending, they said that schools weren't gonna reopen, and government workers were told to work from home, and they said employers should encourage as much as possible their employees to work from home if they can. So they didn't lock things down. The numbers didn't explode too much. I mean, it was really about stopping inbound travelers from coming in. And I think they didn't want to stop Chinese mainlanders or people who regularly travel from coming back. So no one knew anything really about how it spread and anything. So most people I know we just all stayed home, only went out to go to the grocery store. But they got things under control pretty quickly, but we didn't know how bad it would get. And because schools were closed, I think they said until March or something, I went to the US with my family. And so we fled to the US, and I went to California and stayed with my parents. I got there like beginning of February, but by the middle of March, it started getting really bad in the US. And so we fled back. And that's when a lot of people around the world who had fled Hong Kong returned to Hong Kong. Yep. The second wave was when a bunch of expats were returning from abroad because COVID had spread worldwide by that point, I think in March. They closed the borders and people without residency from coming in. And I think that was an important thing that Hong Kong did. We had to quarantine. At the time, we had to quarantine at home for 14 days. We had a wristband, and they tracked you through an app on your phone, and you had to obviously
Because
stay
you
home.
would come from the United States.
Yes, because we came from the United States.
Is that where you're from, California, originally?
I'm from LA originally, born and raised, but I'm Korean American, and we were kind of lucky because right after we returned, they implemented even stricter quarantine measures and rules. Now people are subject to 21-day quarantines. There are like travel bans from the UK, South Africa, Ireland. I mean, pretty much the only way to get to Hong Kong is through Dubai. So Like a lot of people from Hong Kong went to the UK for Christmas and basically got stuck there because of the new variant, and then they implemented these new measures. And so people are trying to get back to Hong Kong via Dubai, but there's a 3-week quarantine there. And then you have to come, if you come here, you have to do a 3-week quarantine, and you can't do it at home anymore.
Oh, wow.
You have to do it in a hotel. So obviously it's cost prohibitive as well. Um,
So it's
and there's
5 weeks of quarantine to come
6
back in. Oh,
because
wow.
it's 3 weeks there and then 3 weeks here. And yeah, 6 weeks of your life. And the thing is that, yeah, you have to stay at a government sanctioned hotel. So I mean, they're pretty strict, but even with all these measures, I mean, there's still COVID and they haven't been able to eliminate it completely. Whereas like my husband's from Taiwan. Taiwan has even been stricter. They actually they didn't have a case for like, I don't know, like 300 days or something like that. I don't think it was ever completely eliminated from Hong Kong. It was actually the expats who had left that all brought it back. There hadn't really been community transmission here, like not widespread community transmission. But the third wave, there was. And I think that was also
And that would have been when?
was
That would
in
have
the
been
summer.
like,
That was, I want to say July, August. July, I went around that time. It
okay.
was like it was summertime. But it's what's also interesting is I feel like these outbreaks are largely in like certain like geographic locations and certain populations. And I'm not exactly sure what caused that wave, but and then this wave, I think it was sparked by these dance parties, which is unbelievable.
What dance parties? What's that about?
Basically, there's a segment of the population in Hong Kong that's very well off, extremely, extremely well off. And these older, very wealthy ladies engage in these dance competitions, I suppose, where they hire these younger male dance instructors who are highly coveted. They fly them in, they like bring them over by, boat, or I'm not exactly sure, but they bring them in. They from outside of Hong Kong. This is normally in normal times, and then they dance. I think some are a little bit more salacious than others. I think some are like purely, you know, dance, and some are more. And anyways, I guess these like older women were having these dance parties without masks indoors in large groups and eating. And as a result, there's a dance cluster of, I don't know, I want to say it was hundreds of people because these women had to dance.
That's bananas.
And unfortunately, there were some even in the building that I live in. And during this time, there were 7 cases in my building, and I couldn't even really leave my flat. So Hong Kong also doesn't, it's really interesting. Whenever there are COVID cases, they publish the building in like where these people live and where they've gone and where they like buildings that these people have been to. So it's
Wow.
all published. So you can look it up. Yeah, people are not as concerned with privacy as they like if it's for the greater good, they'll, you know, jump on your privacy rights. So our building was on this list for weeks. And that also meant that I couldn't go to certain places, which was difficult. We had I think 7 cases in our building. And I mean, that's when I felt really, I think, trapped because I felt like I couldn't even leave my building. I didn't want to go for a walk. I didn't want to go downstairs. I didn't want to get in an elevator. So it was really difficult.
Yeah. I mean, uh, but so, I mean, then just practically, like, how have you guys been dealing? I mean, if you're stuck in, it sounds like even your larger apartment is not palatial. It
I
being
mean,
with, the four of you and I guess six of you stuck in there most of the
yeah.
day. How is that? How does that go? You
So
know?
I tend to be a homebody and an introvert. So I don't mind being home, but for my kids, obviously, it's an issue.
How old are your kids?
So my son is now a little over 2 and my daughter is 6. She'll be 7 in May.
Okay.
So my son was very little when all of this started. My daughter got to start like play groups and, like music classes and all these fun things from the time she was a baby. My son hasn't been able to do anything. It's really sad, actually. So he was supposed to do certain things and everything all canceled. He went to one trial class and then COVID hit and he couldn't go to, so he hasn't been able to go to school. And then I think around like September, October, after the third wave in Hong Kong, I was like, oh, things seem a little bit better. I mean, I waited for a bit. And then I think my son went to like 2 or 3 classes before they shut down schools again because of the fourth wave, which we're currently still experiencing. So, I mean, my poor kids. I feel the worst for them. My daughter has been doing home learning since January of last year, so for a year, and I know my daughter's school has done an amazing job trying to get these kids back in school, like pushing them to let them go back, even if it's, half days. And so because they were able to do that successfully, my daughter is able to go to school every other day. Um, but they have rules like they can't eat lunch at school. So instead they have 2 snack times and I think it's outdoors. They sit on balconies and the school has done a really good job. I feel so bad for schools administrators because I don't know how much things have changed in the US, but I mean, things have changed a lot. I mean, the schools have evolved, have had to change their plans so many times.
Yeah, it's the
Um,
same here.
I don't know how these administrators and teachers do it. They're amazing.
Well, paint a picture for me of kind of the street life of when you leave your apartment, you're going to the store, how is the scene in the in the streets and walking around the city different now than it usually would be?
So I think that there are fewer people and there's less traffic. But that said, I think when this first started, the streets were empty. People weren't out. I mean, people really. I'm really grateful. I live in a place where people abide by masks, and obviously there are mask ordinances in place, and like you have to wear masks indoors. But now, I mean, I think to be honest, I think people are just kind of done with staying home. People are over it. I think people are in parks even and with their kids out and everyone is masked up, but I think more people are out now than previously. I think with each wave more people have become a little bit more relaxed.
Let me ask you this. As an American living there and looking back here at everything that's been going on here in the States, what are the differences you notice in attitude, mentality, logistics, whatever, between how Hong Kong is handling the virus and how the US is doing it?
Okay, I'm going to say something that might be controversial. I think that there's a mentality out in Asia of doing what is best for the greater good. There is a strong sense of that here. And if even prior to COVID, if someone was sick, they would wear a mask because they don't want to get someone else sick. It was protecting other people from you. And
Right.
there's a big sense of that. But I think in the US, people are more concerned with their individual rights. They're more concerned with, well, I care more about my right to breathe. But people are more concerned with their own individual rights. And here people care about their neighbor and don't want to
Yeah.
get their neighbor sick.
But so what have you been thinking and feeling and seeing with all of this, with the
Heartbroken. I'm completely heartbroken by seeing what's going on in the US in terms of COVID and other things. But
this is a safe space. You can vent about anything you're feeling, honestly.
I'm utterly heartbroken. I just feel like The US could have just done things so much better. It really didn't have to be this way. And the fact that even now you were not forced to go under mandatory quarantine upon arrival from the US is just mind-boggling. There's just no way they can control this pandemic if they don't implement simple measures like quarantining upon arrival. I don't understand how that's not happening. When I went to the US back in March, they were like, oh, they saw that I was from Hong Kong. They're like, have you been to China? I was like, no. They're like, go on through, it was just, there was no, and at this point, they should have known. They had time. The US had time to prevent it from getting to the point that it did or that it has. Like my parents are stuck at home. They don't do anything. They have friends who have passed away, and there have been drive-by funerals. There's a backlog in funerals, so can't even have funerals. And it's just really sad. And I know, so like there have been outbreaks at a bunch of, I think, Korean nursing homes in LA. I've had several friends who've had grandparents pass away and can't visit them. You can't see them. You can't go to their funeral. It's heartbreaking. It really shouldn't have gotten to this point. If I didn't think that the US could have done better, that's one thing. But this is the United States of America. It could have done better, and it didn't. It failed everyone. And it's so disappointing. And I it gets so upset when I think about it. And as I'm sure other people do. I also think people are just over it and done. Maybe they just don't care anymore. I mean, we have friends who don't have kids and who are young and are out and about in the US, and they're just like, if I get COVID, I get COVID. And I don't understand that mentality. I mean, I don't. I don't understand it.
What do you see for yourself there, your life there, looking forward the next few months? Are you feeling hopeful? When do you see things? If you were to try and project when you think things might return to something that looks more like normal?
I think I'm generally a pessimistic person. I think I've learned that recently. I personally don't think that things will be better for at least another year, at the very least, I think. I mean, I was talking about it with some friends, and I think that, we're probably not going to be eligible to get the vaccine until maybe summertime. And our kids, we still don't have any data there on how the vaccine impacts children. So I just don't know how, without children also being vaccinated, life returns to normal, like completely normal. But that said, again, like Hong Kong hasn't been under full lockdown ever, and businesses have, for the most part, been open. I think my life is probably a little bit more normal here than it would be in the US, because I don't have to worry about rampant community transmission, if that makes any sense. Like, I can go to certain places and feel relatively safe that the people I interact with will likely not have COVID, because it's just not that widespread. I mean, we're talking like 70 cases a day right now.
Geez, what is it in LA? It's in the hundreds, isn't thousands, isn't it? In Los Angeles County,
Definitely
it's a
in the
lot.
thousands. It's really bad.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think if you, relatively speaking, bad was 100 plus cases, 130 cases. That's considered bad in Hong Kong. I have friends who are getting together with friends regularly, but I think because they feel that it's not in their community of expats or or otherwise, so they feel like it's okay.
Looking forward, not looking forward, but looking ahead toward that, the next 6, 8, 10, who knows, months.
Yeah.
What are you worried about? What do you think about, like, with your kids and your job? And what are you going to do to keep yourself keep them going?
Well, I mean, I think the thing I worry about is, vaccinating my kids. I don't know if it's safe yet. And I worry about whether or not my son's like, learning has been impeded by all of this. Is he going to have like suffer from long-term effects from like not going to school and interacting with other children? I mean, my poor son he hasn't really interacted with other kids very much. I worry about my daughter, whether or not all of this has impacted her. So for better or worse, I mean I'm glad that I was able to be home during all of this so that I could be there for my kids, and they've obviously, I think, needed me during this time. So I'm grateful that I've had that time. But I also want to work. It's impacted the job market here, and
Sure.
it like I don't know how I'm going to go back to work. My husband has a very demanding job, so as much as he wants to, do things for the kids, I mean, he can't be a full-time like mom and do his job. It's just he can't.
I mean, you said that you're an introvert and a homebody, and you chose to be with your kids,
Yeah.
but you must feel a little cooped up and bored at this point.
I think I would feel, frankly, I think I'd feel more cooped up if I was in the US. I don't know, maybe I wouldn't because maybe I'd live in a house and I'd have a backyard. I think the hardest thing is not having space for my kids to run around and play. Um, but I do. I mean, I do feel cooped up. I do feel I do feel this longing for normalcy in life. I long for just like the simple things, just the simple things, just being able to go out and eat at a restaurant with my family. I mean, their restaurants are open until 6 p.m. if you're in groups of two. But do I feel safe eating inside a restaurant? No way.
Because
Um, so
at 6:01, that's when
I
COVID happens. Like it makes so the curfew thing doesn't make any sense to me. Like you have to close here. It's 10. Like think for what when now they're closed again. But
yeah, no, I mean, so while I do think that relatively speaking, Hong Kong has done a great job, like, you know, there are certain things that just don't make sense.
well, I you've been amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all this with me. Do you have
No, not at all.
any
No,
last thoughts? Anything else you want to?
I don't think COVID's been easy for anyone, even if it's been relatively not as bad, but that doesn't mean it's been any easier at all. The conditions under which people live here, people live in tiny, tiny. I mean, you wouldn't believe how small the homes are in Hong Kong. Life is hard for a lot of people, and COVID just makes it so much harder. Life is just really hard for people. So I don't know. I just hope this is all over soon. It seems like too much for people to bear for so long. I don't know. I think we're all going to need therapy after. I definitely will.
This has been The Big Shut-In. My name is David Hoffman, and I produce and story edit the show, along with Tanya Mohammed. Post-production by Garrett Tiedemann. Publication and promotion by Kelsey Kors. It's a production of Racecar Radio, racecarradio.com. If you have a story you think would be a good fit for the show, please do reach out. The Big Shut-In at racecarradio.com.